When we begin to examine the roots of the U.S.-Iran war, we must resist the temptation to see it as a sudden explosion of violence. Wars like this do not erupt overnight. They accumulate. They build quietly, layer by layer, through years of unresolved tension, missed opportunities, and perhaps most importantly, a failure to truly understand the psychology of the other side. At the center of this conflict lies diplomacy, more specifically, the breakdown of it. For years, negotiations surrounding Iran's nuclear ambitions represented not just a political process, but a test of trust between two fundamentally different worldviews. On one side, there was a demand for compliance, transparency, and limitation. On the other, there was a deep-rooted desire for sovereignty, dignity, and security. And here's where it becomes critical. When diplomacy ignores identity, it begins to fail long before the talks collapse. Because diplomacy is not just about agreements on paper, it's about perception. It's about whether each side feels seen, heard, and respected. When those elements disappear, negotiations become performative rather than productive. Words are spoken, but meaning is lost. Promises are made, but belief is absent. And slowly the negotiating table transforms from a place of resolution into a stage for strategic posturing. What we witnessed in the years leading up to this war was a gradual erosion of trust. Agreements were challenged, commitments were questioned, and intentions were doubted. Each action, whether sanctions, military positioning, or political rhetoric, sent signals. And those signals were not interpreted in isolation. They were filtered through history, through fear, and through deeply ingrained narratives about the other. This is where psychology becomes as important as policy. When a nation feels cornered, it doesn't simply comply, it reacts, sometimes defensively, sometimes aggressively, but always in a way that reflects its perception of threat. And when both sides feel threatened at the same time, diplomacy becomes incredibly fragile. It's no longer about finding common ground, it becomes about protecting ground. So what happens when dialogue breaks down under that pressure? The vacuum is not filled with silence. It is filled with action, military action. The transition from failed talks to open conflict is not a leap. It is a slide, a slow, almost inevitable descent where each failed negotiation reduces the cost of confrontation in the minds of decision makers. At some point, the question shifts from how do we avoid war to when does war become necessary? And once that question is seriously entertained, the threshold has already been crossed. In this case, that threshold was crossed through a combination of strategic calculation and emotional momentum. Large-scale strikes were not just military decisions, they were statements that said, diplomacy has failed us, force will speak where words could not. And the response that followed was equally telling. It was not measured restraint, it was retaliation, rapid and expansive, signaling that the conflict had moved beyond negotiation into assertion. But here's the deeper issue we must confront. When diplomacy fails, it doesn't just fail politically, it fails intellectually. It reveals a limitation in our ability to imagine solutions beyond dominance and submission. It shows us that despite all our advancements, we still struggle with one fundamental challenge: how to coexist with those we fundamentally disagree with. And this is not just a geopolitical problem, it's a human one. The same dynamics that break down communication between nations exist in our everyday lives. Misunderstanding, mistrust, the need to be right, the fear of vulnerability. These are not just diplomatic obstacles, they are psychological patterns. Scaled up, they shape the fate of countries. Left unchecked, they lead to conflict. So when we look at this war, we must ask ourselves a deeper question. Was it truly unavoidable, or was it the result of an inability or unwillingness to engage in the kind of dialogue that requires patience, humility, and courage? Because real diplomacy is not about winning. It's about understanding enough to prevent losing everything. And if there is one lesson to take from this moment, it is this. When we allow dialogue to collapse, we do not move forward. We fall back into a cycle where power replaces wisdom and reaction replaces reflection. And history has shown us, time and time again, that when communication ends, conflict begins, not because it must, but because we have not yet learned how to choose otherwise. And once conflict replaces conversation, geography itself begins to speak. And in this case, it speaks through one of the most strategically sensitive waterways on the planet, the Strait of Hormuz. Now, this is where the conversation moves beyond ideology and into something far more tangible, control. Because while diplomacy deals in words, geography deals in leverage. And the Strait of Hormuz is not just a stretch of water, it is a pressure point. A narrow corridor through which a significant portion of the world's energy supply flows every single day. Oil, gas, commerce, lifelines of modern civilization, all passing through a space that can be influenced, restricted, or even shut down. Think about that for a moment. In a world that prides itself on technological advancement and global connectivity, so much of our stability still depends on a single geographic bottleneck. That's not just a strategic reality, it's a vulnerability. And in times of conflict, vulnerabilities don't stay hidden, they become tools. For Iran, the strait represents more than geography, it represents influence. When conventional military parity is not equal, nations often turn to asymmetrical advantages. And control over a choke point like this becomes a form of power that does not require matching force with force. It requires positioning. It's not about dominating everywhere. It's about controlling somewhere that matters to everyone. And that's exactly what makes this situation so complex, because when the strait is threatened, the impact is not confined to the nations directly involved in the conflict. It ripples outward. Oil prices surge, markets react, supply chains strain. And suddenly, a regional conflict begins to feel global. People thousands of miles away, who may not even follow the politics of the Middle East, begin to feel the consequences in their daily lives through fuel costs, inflation, and economic uncertainty. This is where we must pause and recognize something deeper. Power in the modern world is not just about military strength, it's about interconnectedness. The more connected we become, the more exposed we are to disruptions in key nodes of that connection. The Strait of Hormuz is one such node, a place where local tension meets global dependence. But beyond the economics and strategy, there's a psychological dimension that we cannot ignore. When a nation signals its willingness to disrupt such a critical artery, it is not just making a tactical move, it is sending a message that says, we may not control the entire system, but we can influence the system in ways you cannot ignore. And that kind of message shifts the balance of perception, because perception, once again, becomes reality in international relations. The mere threat of disruption can be as powerful as the disruption itself. Ships reroute, insurance costs rise, military forces mobilize, the environment becomes tense, uncertain, reactive. And in that environment, every decision carries more weight. Every miscalculation carries more risk. Now consider what this does to the broader conflict. It raises the stakes. It transforms the strait from a geographic feature into a strategic weapon. And when geography becomes weaponized, it changes how wars are fought. It's no longer just about territory or direct confrontation. It's about influence over systems, over flows, over dependencies. And here's the philosophical question we must confront. What does it say about our world that access to energy, a basic driver of human progress, can be so easily entangled in conflict? It tells us that our systems, while advanced, are not immune to the oldest forces of human behavior: competition, fear, and the pursuit of control. Because at its core, this is not just about oil or shipping lanes, it's about security. It's about a nation asserting its relevance in a system where it feels constrained. And when nations feel constrained, they don't simply accept it. They find ways to push back. Sometimes diplomatically, sometimes economically, and sometimes, as we see here, geographically. But the danger lies in escalation, because once a choke point like this becomes central to a conflict, it invites involvement from others. Global powers cannot afford to ignore it. Naval forces increase their presence. Alliances become more active. And what began as a bilateral tension starts to draw in a wider circle of actors, each with their own interests, their own fears, and their own thresholds for action. And now we're no longer dealing with a contained situation. We're dealing with a system under stress. So the Strait of Hormuz teaches us something profound. In a connected world, the smallest spaces can carry the greatest weight. A narrow passage of water can hold the balance between stability and disruption, between cooperation and conflict. And as we reflect on this, we must ask ourselves, are we building systems that are resilient, or are we building systems that are efficient but fragile? Because there is a difference. Efficiency connects us, but resilience protects us. And if we fail to understand that difference, we risk creating a world where a single point of tension can echo across the entire globe. Because in the end, the real power of the strait is not just in its location, it's in what it reveals about us. That even in an age of progress, we are still learning how to manage the forces that connect us without allowing them to divide us. And the question we must carry forward is simple but urgent. Will we learn to secure the pathways that sustain us, or will we continue to fight over them until they no longer serve anyone at all? And when the pressure of geography intensifies conflict, the natural instinct is to return to the table, to attempt once again what was lost before: dialogue. But here's the reality we must confront. Not all negotiations are created equal. Some are driven by a genuine desire for resolution, while others are shaped by urgency, optics, and strategic positioning. And in moments like this, when tension is high and trust is low, peace talks often become less about peace and more about leverage. This is exactly what we see in the failed attempts to de-escalate this conflict. On the surface, there are meetings, proposals, mediators stepping in, and statements released to the world. It looks like progress. It sounds like effort. But beneath that surface lies something far more complicated: deep, unresolved mistrust that shapes every word, every condition, every pause in the conversation. Because when two sides come to the table carrying years of suspicion, they are not just negotiating terms, they are negotiating fears. And fear does something very specific. It narrows perspective. It makes compromise feel like weakness. It turns flexibility into risk. And so, instead of asking, what can we agree on, the question becomes, what can we not afford to give up? Now think about how that changes the nature of the conversation. It's no longer collaborative, it's defensive. Each side enters the room not to understand, but to protect. And when both sides are protecting at the same time, movement becomes almost impossible. This is where rigid demands begin to dominate. Control over the strait, regional influence, security guarantees. These are not small issues. They are tied to national identity, to survival, to long-term positioning. And when demands are tied to identity, they become non-negotiable in the minds of those presenting them. So what happens? Talks stall, not because solutions don't exist, but because the psychological space required to explore those solutions is missing. And here's something important to understand. Successful negotiation requires more than strategy. It requires trust in the process itself. Not necessarily trust in the other side, but trust that the process can lead somewhere meaningful. When that belief disappears, negotiations become symbolic. They continue, but without expectation. And when expectation is gone, commitment fades. What makes this even more fragile is the environment in which these talks are happening. They are not taking place in isolation. They are happening alongside ongoing military activity, public rhetoric, and international scrutiny. And that creates a contradiction. On one hand, there is an attempt to de-escalate through dialogue. On the other, there are actions that reinforce escalation. Imagine trying to resolve a conflict while simultaneously preparing for its continuation. That tension seeps into every discussion. It creates doubt. It raises questions like, are these talks genuine or are they a delay tactic? And once that doubt takes hold, even the most reasonable proposal can be viewed with suspicion. This is where perception becomes the silent negotiator in the room. It doesn't speak, but it shapes everything. A concession from one side can be seen as a trap by the other. A pause in action can be interpreted as weakness. And suddenly progress is no longer measured by what is offered, but by how it is interpreted. And interpretation, as we know, is rarely neutral. There's also a philosophical layer to this failure that we cannot ignore. It forces us to ask, what is the true purpose of negotiation? Is it to find common ground, or is it to maintain advantage while appearing cooperative? Because if it's the latter, then failure is almost guaranteed. You cannot build peace on a foundation of strategic illusion. Real peace requires something far more difficult. It requires vulnerability. It requires one side to take a step without absolute certainty that the other will respond in kind. And that is one of the hardest things for any nation or any individual to do, because vulnerability feels like exposure. It feels like risk. And in high-stakes situations, risk is often avoided at all costs. But here's the paradox. Without that willingness to risk, there can be no breakthrough, no shift, no genuine resolution, only repetition, talks that begin, stall, and collapse over and over again. And that repetition has consequences. Every failed attempt at peace makes the next attempt harder. It reinforces the belief that dialogue doesn't work. It strengthens the voices that argue for force over discussion. And slowly, the window for peaceful resolution begins to close, not because it was never there, but because it was not used when it mattered most. So when we look at these failed talks, we must go beyond the surface and ask a deeper question. What are we missing in our approach to conflict resolution? Are we focusing too much on outcomes and not enough on the conditions required to reach them? Because peace is not just an agreement, it is a process. A process that requires patience, consistency, and above all, a willingness to see the other side not just as an opponent, but as a participant in a shared reality. And until that shift happens, negotiations will continue to struggle, not for lack of intelligence or strategy, but for lack of trust and perspective. So the lesson here is not just about this conflict, it's about all conflicts. If we enter dialogue only to protect our position, we may preserve our stance, but we lose the opportunity to transform it. And in the end, the question we must ask ourselves is this: are we negotiating to end the conflict, or are we negotiating to manage it? Because one leads to resolution, and the other ensures that the cycle continues. And when negotiations fail and strategic pressure points are activated, the consequences do not remain confined to the battlefield or the negotiating room. They begin to spread, quietly at first, and then all at once, across the entire global system. This is where we begin to understand the true scale of modern conflict. Because what we are witnessing is not just a war between nations, it is a disruption of interconnected systems that billions of people rely on every single day. The moment instability touches a critical artery like the Strait of Hormuz, the effects are no longer regional. They become global, immediate, and deeply personal. You see, we often think of war in terms of images, missiles, troops, maps. But the real impact of conflict in today's world is often invisible. It shows up in rising fuel prices, in increased costs of basic goods, in supply chains that slow down or break entirely. It shows up in uncertainty, economic, political, and psychological. And uncertainty is powerful. It changes behavior. It makes governments cautious, markets reactive, and individuals anxious. It creates an environment where decisions are no longer made from a place of stability, but from a place of anticipation of what might go wrong next. This is how a regional conflict transforms into a global disturbance, not through direct involvement alone, but through indirect impact. A shipping delay in one region becomes a shortage in another. A spike in oil prices in one market becomes inflation in another economy. And suddenly, people who have no direct connection to the conflict find themselves affected by it. That is the reality of interconnectedness. It is both our greatest strength and our greatest vulnerability. Now, from an economic perspective, this kind of disruption exposes something critical: how dependent we are on stability in key regions. The global economy is not evenly balanced. It relies heavily on certain pathways, certain producers, certain routes. And when one of those is compromised, the entire system feels the strain. But beyond the numbers and markets, there is a human dimension that we cannot ignore, because every economic shift eventually translates into lived experience. It affects livelihoods, opportunities, and access to resources. It widens gaps, creates pressure, and in some cases fuels further instability. So, in a very real sense, the consequences of this conflict extend far beyond those directly involved. They ripple into societies, into households, into the everyday decisions people make about how to live, spend, and plan for the future. And this brings us to a deeper realization. In the modern world, there is no such thing as an isolated conflict. Every major disruption is shared, whether we acknowledge it or not. Now, psychologically, this shared impact creates a unique challenge. It can either bring awareness or it can lead to detachment. Some people become more conscious of global dynamics, more engaged, more thoughtful about how events in one part of the world affect another. But others become overwhelmed, disconnected, feeling that these issues are too large, too distant, too complex to engage with. And that response, detachment, is dangerous because it allows critical issues to persist without collective attention. It creates a gap between impact and responsibility. But here's the truth. In a connected world, awareness is no longer optional. It is necessary because the systems that sustain us are global, and their stability depends not just on leaders and policies, but on the level of understanding and engagement within societies. This doesn't mean everyone needs to become an expert in geopolitics, but it does mean recognizing that events like this are not someone else's problem. They are part of a shared reality that influences us all. And from a philosophical standpoint, this forces us to rethink how we define security. Is security just about military strength? Or is it about the resilience of systems, economic, social, and political, that support human life? Because if a single choke point can disrupt economies worldwide, then true security must go beyond defense. It must include stability, cooperation, and foresight. And this is where the opportunity lies. Moments of crisis, as disruptive as they are, also reveal weaknesses. And those weaknesses, once visible, can be addressed. Systems can be diversified, dependencies can be reduced, cooperation can be strengthened, not out of idealism, but out of necessity. But that requires something important: the willingness to learn from disruption rather than simply react to it. Because reacting keeps us in a cycle. Learning allows us to evolve. So as we look at the global consequences of this conflict, we must ask ourselves not just what is happening, but what it is teaching us. What is it revealing about the way our world is structured, about the risks we have accepted, about the assumptions we have made regarding stability and continuity, and more importantly, what are we going to do with that knowledge? Because insight without action changes nothing, and in the end, the lesson is clear. When the world is this connected, the cost of conflict is never contained, it is shared. So the question we must carry forward is not whether global stability matters. We already know it does. The real question is this: will we continue to build a world that reacts to crises, or will we begin to build one that is prepared for them? Because the future will not be shaped by what happens to us, but by how we choose to respond when it does.